So my job is just to kind of help with plant problems essentially, and hopefully help you have better success with your plants. I got a degree from BYU Idaho in horticulture, and then I've been in this industry for 10 plus years at different nurseries and different, mostly retail nurseries, that, different positions along that side. So yeah, I've been in this industry quite a while. I've lived in Utah for 3 years now, so there are a few things with Utah that I'm still getting used to, mostly like sun plants, because I'm from Idaho. So, and I used to live, before I moved here, I lived up in Sun Valley, which is kind of like,
Sun Valley.
it's really pretty, but it's a lot colder. So there's like plants and things that you deal with more here than I would deal up with there. But it's not too much of a difference. I grew up in a
Sun Valley like a zone 5 or something like that?
it's a zone 4, 5-4, depending where you are. Where we're here, we're a zone 6-7. So it's definitely a little warmer here.
But it's a beautiful valley.
It is a very beautiful valley there. Still getting used to Utah to a degree, but it's in the end, it's all about the same. But we also have some really good knowledgeable people here that after the class, if you have any further questions, you can ask me or ask my team here, as well as Emily is really knowledgeable. So we have a lot of options here to kind of help. Just to kind of put in a quick little plug, this is our last in-person class for the spring, because now we're starting to get into the busy season, and we're just going to be too busy doing that. But we are still planning on potentially trying to do some online classes or online forums. So just keep an eye out for for those. If you're on our news list or on our Facebook or Instagram, keep an eye out, and hopefully we're still planning on trying to do some education and interaction through the busy season. And then when fall comes around, we'll probably pick up the classes again in person if you're interested.
Would you let your team know that you're kind of her little thing on Instagram? You can hear him on half of
Oh, yeah, that's true, I heard that one.
Yeah.
It was hard to hear?
Yeah.
Okay.
Probably because it was windy and there was a storm coming.
Yeah, but you couldn't hear. I was like, I loved it, and then halfway through, you couldn't hear what he was saying.
Oh no.
So just to let you know.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, we're all like, a lot of these are spare the
I
moment,
was all
just kind of throw it up and.
listen to that one, and then it was like, I can't hear what he's saying.
Yeah.
What's he saying?
You're good. We try, but technology gets expensive, so we sometimes limitations, but we try our best. I'll let them know. Okay, so I will kind of go through my spring checklist of sorts. Does it have to go exactly in this order? No, not necessarily, but this is kind of how I like to do it to prepare my spring for best success. And the first thing is I kind of take a notepad with me, and I go out and I inspect my hardscapes. So your hardscapes are going to be patios, decks, irrigation, retaining walls, gazebos, things like that, that provide the physical structure, if you will, of your landscape design, okay, or your situation. And if you're doing more for like gardening, that would also be if you're doing raised beds, inspecting if you're doing a wood, is that wood still secure enough to hold what you're wanting to do? Is it starting to warp? Does it need to be refinished to keep it as fresh as possible? Those kind of things. So I always like to kind of start there. Often a lot of these hardscape problems that you might run into, you can do before it's warm enough to do other things, okay? Because they don't necessarily require that warmer season like other to do like soils. Like if you can't dig the soil, you could maybe on a warm sunny day go and paint or refinish the wood deck or something like that. So there's always those kind of things that I always like to start off with when I'm inspecting, just to because those, like, although we like to focus on the plants, those also add that hardscape element adds to your landscape, as well as your gardening structure and things like that. The main, sometimes irrigation may be hard to do it when it's cold because you can't turn it on to physically see if it's working. So you may have to wait for it to be warm enough. But irrigation is a really important one. If you have drip systems, making sure that they're all hooked up, that there's no clogging, or sometimes during the winter, the thawing and freezing can kind of pull things apart. And so I would hate for you to assume, this is usually what happens, is people assume their irrigation is good to go. And then it starts getting warm in the spring, and then summer comes around, and all of a sudden they start seeing dead trees because they didn't check their irrigation. Okay, being in Utah, being a desert area in Utah, it's really important to have that yearly maintenance on your irrigation system. Sometimes twice a year maintenance in the spring, and then also in the fall when you're putting it to sleep, but especially in the spring to make sure it's good. The other thing I like to do, along with, like, let's say you do your your irrigation check and everything seems to be fine, but the other thing you may need to look into is, have your plants grown? When was it last you adjusted your irrigation system to your current landscape? So if you have an older landscape, older trees, bigger trees, things like that, make sure that you check that that you have adjusted accordingly. So what could that be? Drip systems are very popular nowadays, which in general is a good idea because it's more efficient. You get water right where you want it, and you're not putting water where you don't necessarily need it. And so drip can be really good, but often when you first planted a tree and it's like a small tree, you put that irrigation right here really close because that's where the roots are. But as that tree gets bigger, if you don't adjust where the roots are and you don't adjust that sprinkler system or that drip system, then you're potentially not watering where the roots are. Okay, so that could potentially be something you need to be aware of, is adjusting. Now that goes also for garden beds. Like if you're like me, it seems like you always buy another perennial or two and you add it to your flower bed, and when you first put that sprinkler system in or that drip system, you only had 10 plants, and so you had 10 little drippers, but now you've added 10 more in the last 5 years. Are all of those plants getting the irrigation that they need? Okay, so maybe evaluating. The other thing that I've seen is, as bushes or trees or things get bigger, if you have like an overhead sprayer for your flower beds, which is also common instead of doing a drip system, sometimes those sprayers get blocked by trees that have grown. So you may need to shift sprinkler heads around to make sure that you're getting the coverage that you need to keep your plants alive. So it's not just fixing, it's also maybe evaluating your yard and seeing if there's any other, if you need to adjust your sprinkler system to maximize, one, so you use your water efficiently, because we're in a desert, we need to be efficient with our water, and two, so you don't end up wasting money that you spent by having plants struggle or die on you. So that's one thing that I do when I'm doing the hardscape. Now, while I'm doing this inspection, if you will, whether it's hardscape inspection specifically or not, I also like to keep like an eye out for potential problems. So, oh, I saw this tree had a broken limb, or this tree is really overgrown, or last year I have a dead spot on my lawn. Why is that? Kind of making note of potential issues that I see, just so that, because If you're like me, I see it once. If I don't write it, I tend to not come back to fix it. Okay? So just using this time to kind of evaluate your landscape and seeing what you need to maybe be aware of or keep an eye on as you get further into the year is always a good thing to do as well, just to monitor those kind of issues. Now, monitoring for pests or diseases and stuff, obviously in the spring or in the winter when things are dormant, it may be hard to kind of see some of those things. So some of it's also remembering back to last fall. Were there any issues that I had last year with certain trees or lawns or garden spaces or areas, and maybe making note of those and how they look in the spring? Are they leafing out just fine? Okay, if it seems to be fine this year, but last year had a problem, maybe it was just we had a weird wet spring and so we had problems, but maybe this year we won't. So being a kind of comparing last year issues with this year as you're watching things wake up and things like that. And we're going to go into preventative of pests and disease here in a second. I don't want to go into too much detail, but when you're doing that walk around your yard, I think it's also important to kind of maybe have that in the back of your head, because like anything, preventative is better than curative, okay? So the sooner you can catch a problem, the better you can deal with it. If you wait till the end where like, oh, I have a weed patch starting to grow right here, if you wait till fall to do it, it's already gone to flower, it's already sent seeds, and then you're gonna have a bigger problem, where if you had spotted it early and taken care of it in the spring, then maybe it wouldn't be as big of a problem down the road. And that's the same with diseases. So when you're doing this check on your hardscapes and on your plants and stuff, kind of evaluate that and help there. Any questions about that process? Any thoughts on that or questions? Okay. Spring. So after I do the hardscapes, look at the irrigation, look at all that, I go to the typical spring cleaning. In spring cleaning, we, like the list that I have here of the typical things that you may deal with in your spring cleaning is garden beds, raking away leaves and debris from garden beds and boxes, okay? Wrapping trees, so if you had any trees wrapped for the winter, whether it's like arborvitaes or the trunks were wrapped to protect against winter burn or winter scalding, now is a good time to unwrap those. You don't want to leave those trees wrapped through into that, because if you leave them wrapped, then it makes nice little areas for insects to hide in and to kind of winter over, or to kind of wake up in as when it's still that cold, when it's kind of cold. So it just kind of makes a nice home for them. So we want to remove that just so that we don't encourage insect populations right about around your valuable, your fruit trees or your landscape trees and things like that.
Seems like this is the time of year when we get the really heavy snowstorms. So it's like, I have some wrapped things, so it's like, I don't know.
So the wrapped arborvitaes, you're probably fine, I should clarify. I'm thinking more of the trunk wraps specifically. Arborvitae, yes, we do, being that we're warmer, the snow that we get this time of year tends to be more wet, and so it's heavier, okay? And that's something to be aware of, because that heavier snow, this is usually when people end up breaking branches, or arborvitaes getting smashed or falling apart and things like that. So you're probably fine leaving arborvitaes wrapped, but it's part of that spring cleanup. Not everything happens all at once. This might be, it's just to kind of put it on your to-do list of one, but especially the ones around trunks, like those ones, those ones are ones that are tied against trunks that insects can kind of get underneath. And is it, like, if you waited a few extra days, is it going to be a problem? Probably not. But it's just something to be aware of, to just kind of clean things up along that line. And we kind of, inspecting trees, we kind of talked about that already. And then tool sharpening, and then pruning, which is part of the yard cleanup. So let's quickly talk about garden beds.
Can I just ask you
Yeah.
a question? Going back to wrapping trees.
Yeah.
What diameter do you not need to wrap a tree?
So I usually say once the bark is starting to get more mature, which is usually a rougher bark, so as long as the bark is that smooth young wood look,
Wrap.
it's more prone to winter scalding. Once it kind of starts getting more barky looking, where it has like it starts to get older, starts to get more rigid, things like that, that's an indication that that wood is maturing enough or getting old enough that it's starting to, it should protect itself.
Okay, sometimes with like flowering trees, their bark doesn't get.
Yeah,
anyway?
so there's different, yeah, you kind of have to, you're right, not all bark does that. But usually there's a difference between the young bark and the mature bark. So normally it's that mature bark, even if it doesn't quite get as rigid or bumpy as maybe as like a boxwood or like a, what's the word, like a willow or something like that would. But it's kind of that's my basic rule. The other basic rule is obviously if you've had the tree for 3+ years and it's starting to get established to your area, then they tend to be more adjusted.
Okay.
But as long as you have that younger, smoother bark, there's always that chance, I guess. Even on big trees with really rough bark, they still have that chance of getting winter scald. So it's not like, but they tend to have less of a chance, like less of a risk compared to younger trees.
Thank you.
So garden beds and raking up leaves and debris from the garden boxes. Okay, so there's kind of two camps here. There's the one camp of leave the leaves, okay, as long as you can, so that, no, this is this camp over here, no, sorry, it's my brain. The first camp, leave the leaves so that they allow areas for beneficial insects to hibernate and like pollinators and things like that, okay? So that's one camp. And then there's the other camp that are like, well, if you leave the leaves, you're also leaving a habitat for the pests, such as box elder bugs and things that like to also lay their eggs and eat. So they're so obviously there's kind of a middle ground there, okay?
I clean up my leaves and I still have plenty of ladybugs every single year.
Yeah. Well, ladybugs are different. There's other kind of beneficial insects. Ladybugs are just one of billions of beneficial
I still
insects.
have tons of beneficial insects in my garden every single year.
So
I'm just saying.
some of the beneficial insects that there's been plenty of studies showing that the insect population is substantially declining in our environment, okay, substantially, whether it's good or bad insects, okay, especially in cities, and that's like if you think of it, it's expected that that population is going down, okay, and that could be with how many insects we use or insecticides we use in our yards, how many like the habitat for them is going down, and to be honest, without insects our life would not function properly, okay? So insects are important, but there is that balance there of bad versus good and things like that, okay? So I'm not here to make that choice for you, and you have your garden's needs. The idea is if you leave some leaves for the beneficials, hopefully they will also help take care of the bad bugs as well, so they kind of have more of an ecosystem, where if you just clean it up all the time, then maybe you're not getting that ecosystem. Toss up to me. I agree, because sometimes I get more problems than they're worth. So kind of how I like to approach it is like, do I have a problem? If I consistently have a problem that maybe contribute to the leaves, such as coddling moth in my apples or pear trees, then yeah, I'm gonna clean up. I'm gonna clean up, okay? If I have an area, if I have a big property and I have an area in the back of my property that I don't really go out there as much, might as well leave those and help it. Because there are, one of the ones that I know cleaning up leaves can be detrimental to for beneficial are the mason bees. So mason bees are very popular or a very important insect in our ecosystem. A lot of people hear about the honeybees, but the mason bees are the really teeny bees, and they tend to start several weeks to months before the honeybees start.
Can leaving the grass clippings back by my, because I go up to the canal.
Grass clippings probably won't. They need more leaf mass that they to kind of do their stuff in. So now the thing is a lot of these like mason bees, they wake up a lot earlier than honeybees do. And so if you have fruit trees in your yard that bloom in that early spring, before the honeybees are really active, it's the mason bees that are pollinating your trees in most cases, okay? And leaves can be really important resource for them to survive. Okay, now, the trick is, once they're done, they might bloom early, they might hatch or get active before other kind of bad insects might get going. So you can try to find this balance of leaving your leaf mass through that through maybe early spring, giving them a chance to, before you clean them up and throw them away, because if you clean and throw them away, then they hatch in a garbage can and die kind of idea, or in a bag. So you leave it long enough for them to kind of hatch, and then you can go in and clean up more mid-spring, late spring, to try to clean up anything else that might be. So you can kind of try to find that balance there if you so choose to, okay? So I'm not here to make your choices. I'm just here to kind of hopefully educate and give you ideas. But it's definitely that balance there. Leaving leaves can be beneficial for the ecosystem, but at the same time, if you know you have a consistent pest problem, then maybe it's not worth dealing with that, and it's just let's clean that section up. So you can kind of hit and miss, or you could say, I'm going to clean it up by these ones, but I'm going to keep it in the back where I'm not as much. So you can kind of find what works for you. But insects are a very important part of our ecosystem. So that's just something to kind of think about with leaves. Now, kind of to your question, using them as a mulch, okay? So, or as a compost, because kind of how your question of using leaves in raised beds. Using leaves in raised beds is more or less using it as a compost, okay? Now, when composting, quickly about composting, you have your green matter and you have your brown matter. Green matter is going to be more like food scraps, things that are more alive, or I don't know if alive is the right word, but like have been alive more recently, I guess. And then so like fruit that like it sits on your shelf, it ripens, it's still actively doing things, versus leaves, which are usually considered a brown matter, okay? Something that's been, and it's more fibrous maybe, and normally you're trying to get a balance there. So if you just put leaves in your bed and till that in, like, or not till it, if you just put your leaves and then some people will put like soil on top, that brown matter will slowly decompose. But because if you don't put green matter in there, it's going to be a very slow compost because it takes longer to decompose brown matter. Now, if you mix the two, then you get it. Green matter decomposes really quickly, but then it doesn't last as long. So normally you'd kind of do a mix, okay? So it's kind of that idea of when you're doing layering with like compost in a bed. So if you do get a lot of leaves and you're like, oh, I should use these, a few things you can consider. One is you consider ripping up your leaves. So you can actually buy these leaf chopper things, or I forget what it's called. You pretty much put it in a bag and it shreds it up. That's gonna make your leaves decompose faster, okay? So if you do decide to use it in something like that, chopping it up might be beneficial to get the benefits of that compost sooner. If you just put it in the bottom, it's going to take longer to decompose. Mixing in with or green matter will also help. Now, and if you're putting it substantially, like if you have like let's say a 16-inch raised bed, and you put it on the bottom and you put the soil on the top, I don't think you're going to worry too much about insect problems. Could maybe insects hatch and work their way out? Yes, but in general, if you're doing it substantial amount of soil on top, you're probably not going to have to worry about insect problems too much. But then after you fill it up and you have more leaves, then you're just putting it on top and you're just mixing it in, and then you might have problems there if you have pest problems with the leaves that you've had in the past.
Yeah, I'm kind of wondering, as you know, as the winter, my beds have gone down a little bit, and so it's like I was thinking of putting some leaves, putting some like manure.
Yeah.
I don't know.
So manure is definitely more on the green side because that's gonna break down faster. So you could try to find balance, like kind of that idea of some leaves might have bad pests in it. You're gonna have to think back, have I had problems in the past with problems? Do I want to deal with that? If you don't shred up those leaves, it's going to take longer to decompose, and then sometimes that's annoying when gardening to wait for those to decompose because it can take several seasons for whole leaves to decompose. Will it eventually decompose? Yes. The other thing you kind of have to realize when it comes to compost, okay, is compost steals nitrogen to break down. So let's say you have an X amount of nitrogen in your soil, you put something in it that needs to decompose, such as leaves. Some of that amount of nitrogen is going to be stolen from that soil and tied up with that decomposition of leaves. Now, once those leaves get decomposed to enough, they will eventually release that nitrogen back and probably more nitrogen back into the soil. But for a moment, for however long it takes to decompose, it's going to tie up that nitrogen potentially, okay? And if you don't have a lot of nitrogen in your soil to begin with, maybe and so then you can buy things like ammonium nitrate that adds a lot of nitrogen to help with composition, but that also shredding it up is going to help it decompose faster. So that's kind of the idea.
Aren't bean plants though also good at putting the nitrogen back?
So legumes in general, yes, legumes have a system in their root system where they actually, instead of taking new nitrogen out of the soil, they still take nitrogen, but they're not good at capturing it, and so they end up releasing a lot of nitrogen back into the soil. So yes, legumes can help rejuvenate beds with nitrogen. Unless you do a soil test, it's hard to know whether that's enough nitrogen or things like that. So that's why doing like a cover crop with legumes is really important, or it's not really important, but can be beneficial because it's more of a natural way to keep nitrogen in your soil. Where like tomatoes really steal a lot of nitrogen out of your soil, and they don't replenish it. So sometimes if you only grow tomatoes, you always have to add that nitrogen to help. And we'll kind of get into fertilizers here in a second in more detail. But yes, that kind, as far as the leaves go, those are things you kind of have to kind of contemplate. That's why often you want some green matter with the brown matter when you're doing compost bins. Now, if you just do a compost bin and you wait to put it in your garden, and you compost it, and then you put it in your garden, that's different because it's already composted. But if you put those leaves directly into your flower beds or into your garden boxes, then it's gonna take a lot longer for those leaves to decompose. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so last year, I do have a shredder, so last year I shredded some leaves
Uh-huh.
and then put manure on and just kind of mixed
Yeah.
it in to raise the level.
Yep.
So
In
that's
general,
okay.
I don't like, there's not necessarily anything wrong with that per se, but the concerns are like maybe that pulled some nitrogen, but hopefully with the manure it added nitrogen. maybe, there's a lot of just maybes. And half of gardening is experimenting. And if you had great success and you found a system that works for you, by all means, do it. Like,
It seemed to work.
so I'm not saying that there's a right or wrong way. There's things to maybe consider, and you're like, okay, yeah, my tomatoes didn't do as well that year. They're a really high nitrogen guzzler. Maybe by putting the leaves in, it pulled out some of that nitrogen. But maybe you had really good success, so maybe the manure you put in, the fertilizer was enough to compensate, and now you have more organic matter in your thing. So in general, adding organic matter is never a bad thing. So adding those leaves is never going to be necessarily bad. It's just, it may tie up some of that nitrogen and issues
So
and
Todd,
things like that.
just so we can answer this question, because I don't ever add leaves or anything to my garden, but you know, my top bed always sinks down, and I'm always like, okay, what product should I add to the top of my bed to help fill it
Perfect.
back up?
So actually, we're going to talk about that in soil mulch in the next section here. So we'll just jump over to that soil mulch since we're on that topic. So when it comes to gardening beds, whether it's flower beds, garden boxes, if you're rototilling a big area, whatever you're doing, soil health is important.
Because my husband he just said, let's just go buy a bunch of manure, and I said, no, you don't just add a bunch of manure to the top of the bed, honey.
So, first of all, one thing you may want to consider doing is getting a soil test done, okay? Because we can imply issues based on what was planted in there and if we had past issues, things like that. But possibly getting a soil test done may be a really good way to be more specific with what you need to do with your soil. Now, do you have to do that? No, not at all. But soil test, just for an FYI, USU. If you just Google USU soil test, you will get an email that will give you instructions on how to submit a soil test to USU. They have a few different options. I would recommend the more expensive one because that would also help you know your micronutrients, your pH of your soil, and not just your NPK. So that is if you want to be more specific, that's a really good resource because then you can know what you need to do to amend it and to add to it. But the other thing is there's kind of two things you kind of need to realize. There's amendments for your soil, and then there is a mulch. Mulch and amendments are sometimes there's the same thing, but you just use them differently. The product could be a mulch and an amendment, but you use them differently. So for garden beds that have sunk, which is a good sign, to be honest. If it sinks, that means that the organic matter you have in your flower bed is decomposing, which is making good soil. Okay? And normally when it sinks, the goal is to replenish that organic matter in your soil. Now, some things to maybe just be aware of on that. It kind of depends a little bit on what mix you have. Do you have a soil mix with a lot of heavy soil in it? Or is it a soilless mix with a lot of peat moss in it? Maybe it may kind of vary how you need to amend it, but in general, you just want to add organic matter. And what is organic matter? Compost, okay? Now, compost can be a lot of things, okay? It can be manure. It can be forest byproduct. It can be bark. It can be chicken manure. It can be, there's a lot of things that can be considered compost.
So if I just added the conditioner,
Yep.
I would be good.
I would be totally fine. That's what I did at my old house. I had a 4 by 5 foot garden box, and I pretty much just bought one of these soil conditioners right here, and I just threw that in and called it good.
I love that stuff.
I really like that stuff too. The big one in the back.
I
Yep.
love that stuff.
Does that work for veg beds as well as just flower
Yep.
beds?
Oh,
Yep.
that is the best.
It's
Love
just
that
a
stuff.
generic soil
And
conditioner.
it's got the bark, the
It
really
has a
small
little
piece
bit
of
of bark
the
in it now That does not have peat in it, and that's what it's like. So if you have a bed that is a soilless mix, maybe getting a compost, like we have a compost out here called organic compost that has some peat in it. So if you feel like you need to like build up, so and that's the other question is sometimes depending on your box, soil might wash away as well. It's not just composting. It's not just shrinking from composting. It's also shrinking because as you watered, some of that dirt and peat moss and whatnot has kind of washed through the cracks of your wooded or whatever kind of raised bed you have, or if you're on a slope and it gets raised. So if you feel that you just amending the soil isn't going to be sufficient enough to bring up that level, the raised bed to the right level that you want it to be at, then you may need to also consider adding something to it that it like soil, like just straight soil, just to actually build it up, or peat moss or something like that. So that is also something to consider. If it is substantially deeper, maybe adding actual growing medium is also needed.
So like a couple bags of the actual raised bed dirt.
Yeah, the actual raised bed dirt, such that we have something called Rich and Complete here, or the same brand that does this, the soil build, this Garden and Bloom brand, they have a product out here called Harvest Supreme that I like a lot as well. That one is pretty much the same thing as this one, but maybe a little finer, so it's a little softer, a little, and definitely maybe more geared towards vegetable gardens, where this is kind of just garden in general.
But it's good for the raised beds.
But that one can also help the raised bed garden soil. So there's kind of two ways to think about it when preparing your soil in your garden boxes. Is do I just need to amend it, or do I need to amend it as well as build it up with actual growing
Can
medium?
I ask you one more question about that? If I wanted to do a tomato in a pot, would that be good for a tomato in a pot? Okay.
Yes, it's labeled more specifically as a compost, but it does. If you read the back on the Harvest Supreme, it does say you can plant directly in it as well. But you could also get just a normal soil, like
Peppers in
potting
pots
soil
or
would
whatever.
probably be fine as well. Things like that.
Okay, I just was wondering if I could do that for all of my bed, because I
You
do
probably could.
Okay.
You
just wanted to
probably
see.
could.
Okay.
So that is kind of the idea of building it. Now, if you are not growing in raised beds and you just have a plot that you're growing in organic matter, that's usually more of a solid soil base. Okay, it's not like this light mix that in a raised bed. That's going to be a heavier soil. The more organic matter you can amend into your soil, the better. And in general, you can never go wrong with too much organic matter. Okay? Now, unless you are just using straight manure that hasn't decomposed and is too hot, then maybe you're going the wrong direction. But in general, if you get a good compost, you're never going to go wrong putting too much in your garden, especially if it's a soil-based product.
What about Nutrimulch on the top?
Nutrimulch is a great compost as well. So I would mix it in.
More as a mulch as opposed to a compost.
So if you're amending the soil, you want to mix it in. Okay, so I would mix it in if you're trying to help the soil. Because a mulch is a little different than a compost. Like, things can be both a mulch and a compost depending on how you use it. Okay.
So I have a lot of areas where it's just, there's so much stuff, I can't really amend the soil per se. All I can really do is put stuff on the top and hope it seeps down into the soil. So that's why, I just kind of got that.
That is a really great thing for that, the conditioner.
Yeah, the conditioner can use that.
I use the conditioner for that in a lot of places because it has the bark in it, and so the beds that need the mulch and the top dressing, I use that for that.
So you can, obviously getting it mixed into the soil is always going to be better. So if you can get a small enough tool to kind of dig it in, possibly that would be better. But if you can't, then doing a mulch can help. and hopefully as it sits and as it decomposes, it will work into the soil. But it's going to be the time frame of helping that soil is going to be longer versus mixing it in.
Well, and
So
these are my perennial beds that
yeah.
have a lot of shrubs in them as well, and
Yeah.
so trying to,
No, I totally get you. I totally get you. It's just to be aware, like if you can mix it in, it's going to be better. But if you can't mix it in, obviously putting a mulch. Now a mulch, there's kind of two ways to think of a mulch. One is you could just throw it on top, and it's decorative, or it could just be to kind of hopefully help the soil down the road.
Yeah.
But a mulch can also help with weed prevention and sometimes insect control. Okay, but mostly for weed prevention. But for a mulch to be effective, most studies show that it needs to be at least 2 to 3 inches thick for it to be effective as a weed prevention. Okay. So if you're putting it on less than 2 inches, it's mostly just decorative / amending the soil with the long-term amending where it breaks down eventually.
But that goes both ways. For example, I sow zinnias and cosmos in this particular area, and if I put too much mulch in, it's going to be the same problem that I would have with
Yeah, if you're growing things from seed, definitely. If you're growing things from a plug, then hopefully the mulch is fine. Or from a plant. Because pretty much weed seeds there's 3 things. They need light, they need water, and they need temperatures, okay, to germinate properly. And pretty much what a mulch does is you're trying to eliminate the light factor. So you're putting on enough mulch on top that it keeps the sun out, not allowing that seed to get the signal that they can start germinating.
So, because that's one thing where I always screw up on with my mulch is I'm always petrified in the spring that I'm going to kill my perennials that haven't come in if I put it on too thick. I'm okay because most of them are plugs and stuff.
Yeah. Now, there is the rule of not wanting to bury the root crown.
I always try really
so
hard,
so you
but I
can
can't
try
remember
to
everything,
put the mulch up to the plant where you want it, but not bury it. So you can try to find that balance there of not burying but once they start really sending up growth, you're usually fine.
Yeah.
But again, you don't necessarily want to bury that root crown.
But
Which-
there's always the ones like your hibiscus and stuff that you can't quite remember where they are.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
So get a flag in the fall. Flag where you know, so you know where they are. But I don't know if that doesn't work for everyone, but that is a solution. Sometimes I'll put markers out or a painted rock.
Well, see, that's why
So it's not as obvious.
I'm kind of screwed because I don't. It's like, okay, am I not? I don't want to kill my perennials.
No, there's always a balance in gardening. Always a balance there, trying to find that balance, getting the benefits of a mulch, but not killing things, kind of thing. So, so soil test. Amend the soil. You can never go wrong with too much organic matter. And then a mulch, if you're actually doing a mulch for the purpose of weed control, it needs to be at least 2 inches. Okay? And that goes also, rock is a little different. Rock can be used as a mulch as well. But again, what is the purpose of a mulch for weed control? Is it blocks out the sun. Okay, so if you get these big boulders of rock, let's say this is a rock, this is a rock, I put them together, they're leaning, there's a lot more big gaps that allow sun through, and so then it tends to not be as good. So rock, usually you have to even go thicker in order for the benefits of weed control. Okay, so that's why, unless you have like really small rocks that kind of with sand mixed in, more like a pathway rock kind of thing, that kind of blocks out that sun. So that's the problem with rock.
Well, and then it doesn't let the plants get wider that you think.
There's other issues with rocks as well, such as heat. So they get a lot hotter than a mulch does. There's other issues. I'm not a big fan of using rock as a mulch, but it does have its place and purpose depending on your landscape needs. Okay, but if you're using it without like a weed barrier or something, because that's why weed barriers work, is one, they're kind of like a blackout curtain, so you can get that same effect of hopefully keeping the seeds from germinating as much because it blocks out that sun. But
then you get dirt on top of them,
Right.
and then
And you just have to break out the Roundup and forget about it.
exactly. So that's the problem with rock. Is sometimes if you're using it to try to for weed prevention, it tends to not work that well because most people don't want to put in a thick layer of rock. They just want that decorative thin layer on top, but then it doesn't help with weed prevention. So where mulch, like a bark, things like that are easier because they tend to mat out that sun easier and keep the weeds down. Now, is it going to be 100% keep weedings out? No. But that's definitely something in the spring to do because you want to try to put that mulch on before the seeds start to germinate. Because if the seeds are already germinating, putting that mulch on isn't going to kill them. They're just going to work that way through.
What about pre-emergence?
Pre-emergents are also a good option to do pre-emergence, especially if you're not planning on planting any seeds. Okay, if you're doing seeds, whether it's grass seed or normal or flower seeds, don't do a pre-emergent because it would also kill your seeds, okay? Or it doesn't necessarily kill them, but it prevents them from germinating properly, and then they die. But if you have an established yard and doing pre-emergent, the pre-emergent that I often recommend is this guy right here. This is your, if you've ever heard of preen, this is the same thing, it's just a different brand. Okay, same active ingredient. Now, preen, just a quick little pro tip, preen works better if worked into the soil. Okay, if you just put it on the top, you'll get maybe a week or two of control, but then it dissipates really quickly. If you actually mix it into the soil, it will last a few months. So,
I thought it was just the opposite of that it made you wet it down and then it makes kind of this
how
mess.
preen works, you want it in the soil. It depends on the kind of pre-emergence. Some pre-emergents kind of make this cloud barrier. Preen actually, what it does is it root prunes. So as the seed tries to germinate, it prevents those roots from growing properly, causing the seed to die. And so if it's down in the soil where the roots are, it tends to do better.
So what about your perennials that self-seed? You know,
Yes.
like your lamb's ear
Yep,
and
if
stuff
you
like
have
that,
perennials that you
will-
want to self-seed and you put a pre-emergent on, you're probably preventing those self-seeding annuals or perennials from coming
Okay.
back.
What about
Okay, or
putting them
spreading.
around trees?
Say that again?
What about putting that around trees?
As long as the
No.
tree is well established, you're totally fine with that product.
Okay.
Now, there are other kind of pre-emergents that you may need to read the label and just to be on the safe side, because some pre-emergents are stronger or affect differently, and they may affect actual living woody plants. So you just have to kind of read the label. That specific one, you're totally fine doing it around woody plants, because
Like I have trees in my
yeah,
park.
trees, shrubs, you're fine
And-
using that.
All the little plants are starting to come up.
Mhm.
And I did put bark, but I didn't put it 2 inches.
Yeah. Yep. So yeah, and now like the bark, if it's not 2 inches, it'll look nice and it makes the garden look nice, but it may not be as
So I need
effective at keeping the weeds down.
I need to go through.
So let's move on here. We kind of jumped down to the soil mulch, but I wanted to quickly go over tools. Okay. Tools, like anything in life, if you take care of it, it'll take care of you. And that's the same thing with tools, okay? If you have tools that you use all the time, pruners, shovels, rakes, if you get some linseed oil and rub down the wooden handles, keep those safe, you won't get slivers, you'll enjoy your gardening experience better. That's always my problem. I get these old tools out that I didn't take care of, and then the hinges don't work as well, or I get slivers on my hands, so I'm always putting gloves on, and then it just makes it more of a hassle. Okay? And if you keep your tools nice, you will enjoy your experience better. That's my tidbit there. I don't want to necessarily get into the details on how to sharpen tools or how to take care of them, but especially if you didn't do a fall tool care. We had a fall tool care class because that's usually people have used them through the winter or through the summer, and then you want to take care of them that fall before you put them to bed so they don't rust during the winter, oil them, things like that. But if you didn't do that during the winter, spring is maybe the next time to do it before you start using them. oiling if you have wooden handles, getting a linseed oil just so that they stay hydrated, so you don't get slivers. Shovels that are sharpened are going to always be more effective at cutting into dirt and things like that than a dull blade, especially if you work with a lot of rock. They're going to dull that blade a lot if you have like a rock mulch that you're always moving around. So sharpening tools can make life a lot easier. Okay, so that's just my little tidbit there. If you can take care of your tools, they will help take care of you in the long run.
How do
Okay.
you feel about fiberglass shovels?
So fiberglass is lighter, okay, and so if like wood can get heavy, okay, and so fiberglass is great. Is fiberglass as strong as wood? In general, I would say probably. So in general, I like fiberglass, but once fiberglass, if you put a little too much pressure on there and it cracks, you get those little slivers on fiberglass. Oh, I hate them. So it's like in general, I think fiberglass is totally fine, and especially if you're like, I hate heavy shovels, fiberglass may be lighter than a wooden shovel, making it easier to do things. But if you don't take care of it, or you accidentally crack it, or like they can deteriorate over time just as much as any other tool. I have to maybe look up fiberglass care. I'm not sure on fiberglass care if you can take care of those. Like the nice thing about wood is you can, if you're good at of oiling them occasionally and taking care of them, wood handles will last forever. So, so spring fertilizing. What time is it? Okay, spring fertilizing. Spring is a great time to fertilize. So once I did my inspection, I've checked things, I've cleaned up flower beds, I go to my soil next, I fix my soil, I get my soil to the proper texture that I like. Now we want to consider fertilizing and doing things like that. Spring in general is a really good time to fertilize. This is when trees and shrubs are starting to wake up. They're starting to put roots down. They're starting to be more active. So giving them a fertilizer this time of year can often give your lawn, trees or shrubs that little bit of a jump start to kind of really have a good green, successful growing year. Okay, now there's some caveats there though. Okay, one of them is being like, is the tree stressed out from last year or from the winter? Okay, is the tree stressed? If it's stressed, maybe putting a fertilizer on it is actually going to be more detrimental than helpful. Okay, so that's one thing to consider. The other thing to consider is it a new plant or an older plant? Okay, if it's a well-established older plant, doing a basic fertilizer is probably just fine. But if it's a younger plant, again, if you do the wrong kind of fertilizer, maybe it will encourage the wrong kind of growth, and I'll go over that here in a second. So those are some things to consider when fertilizing trees and shrubs and even your lawn, okay, is to kind of consider, has it had problems in the past? If it does, will a fertilizer be a problem? And two, is it an older or a younger tree? Okay, so if it's an older established tree or shrub, I really like this product right here. It's just a basic tree shrub fertilizer. It's a 19-8-10. 19 is your nitrogen. The middle number is your NPK. P is your phosphorus. And then 10 is your potash or potassium. Okay? Now, nitrogen promotes leaf growth and stem growth. So on older trees that you just want it to keep getting bigger and be lush with bright green leaves and things like that, getting something with a higher nitrogen, which is the first number, that is going to promote more of that leaf growth.
Would that be good for a golden chain tree?
Probably.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, we just got one here last year, and I don't want to mess it up because it's a.
Well, if you got it last year, I'll go over young trees here in a second.
Oh, young trees. Okay.
Okay, so this is more for established trees and shrubs that you have that you are trying to
So
help.
like a 30-year-old elm tree.
Not even, yeah, 30 log trim definitely would kind of fall under that category, that you want to give it some fertilizer as long as the elm tree is healthy and good and you're just trying to do a basic fertilizer. Even a 5-year-old tree is probably mature enough and established enough in your tree that you could use something like this. So you don't have to wait till 30 years.
But
5
not
years.
for evergreen.
This works for evergreens as well.
Arborvitae?
Yep, this will work for arborvitaes. This is, so NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, whether it's a 10-10-10 or a 15-15-15 or a 16-8-10, that is just the percentage of that nutrients in the bag.
So when you put that on, you put it on the root zone?
Yeah, I'll get,
As far-
yeah.
You'll get.
Well, in general, as far as like putting it on, normally you want to put it around the root zone, but also always read the label. They usually give you instructions. Some fertilizers you might want to inject into the soil. Some fertilizers you just want to put on top. And I'll go into some details here in a second. But the general thing I was saying, whatever these numbers are, that is just NPK is NPK. Nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus. Nitrogen, potassium. Like whether you get it from another source or this source, there are some nuances if you really want to get into the detail, fast release versus slow release and things like that. But nitrogen's nitrogen, whether you get it in a 19 or you got it in a 16-16-16. So in general, on established trees, you're doing good. The thing I like about this one is it also, if you go to the analysis, it also has sulfur, boron, copper, iron, magnesium, manganese, not magnesium, manganese, zinc. These are your micronutrients that trees and plants need for, like, to grow well. Think of 19 as your bread, okay? That is like your carbs. I'm going to live as long as I have bread. Am I going to be nutriently sufficient? Maybe not, because all I ate is bread. And so you also need your carrots, and you need your other vitamins and things like that. And that's where the micronutrients comes in, okay? So that's kind of an analogy to try to help understand. These are must-have to grow, but these micronutrients that this also comes with help. So, yes?
Can I ask you a specific question?
After class maybe?
Okay.
Because I'm running out of time. So the tree and shrub food is a really good one for established plants. Now, if you have a plant that is struggling because it's like it didn't get established well, or it's a younger tree, or it's been having problems with diseases or things like that, I often recommend something more like this root stimulator, which is a 4-10-3. So it's higher in the middle number. And what the middle number promotes is root development. And root development, because if you have a tree that has a problem on the top and you give it a lot of nitrogen, it's going to try to grow something on top. But if it has dead branches or diseased branches or things like that, it sometimes is putting energy where you don't want it. But if we can encourage that root system to grow, hopefully in turn, if it has a stronger foundation, it will then be able to pull nutrients and energy from the roots to help the top better. So for trees that are younger, that you've only had a year or less, doing a root stimulator, because even though you've bought it last year, that tree probably is not fully rooted in yet. It's not fully established. And so if we encourage it with a high nitrogen, then it might put more energy into leaves, and then when the hot summer comes, it has more leaf mass, but not necessarily the root mass to kind of help compensate.
How many years would you say after
I
planting?
usually say up to 3 years. I'd say most trees, there's two rules of thumb. I say 3 years just to be safe. Just because in most cases I say it takes about 3-ish years for a plant to fully get rooted in. The other rule is about a year for every inch of trunk diameter. So if you get like a 4-inch, like a really big established tree, and you plant it, and it's a 4-inch trunk diameter, it's going to take at least 4 years for it to fully root in.
Is this going to be good for shrubs as well?
This is great for everything.
So the hydrangeas I bought last
Yep.
year, put it around the hydrangea.
Yep, you could use this on hydrangeas and things like that. And this middle number will help with that root development. Now, talking about hydrangeas or flowering plants, sometimes picking something with a high middle number, and this is also for gardening, for your flowers, your perennials, and things like this. This middle number also helps promote flowering, not just root system, it also helps promote flowering. So if you have a flower bed that you're doing your spring cleaning and your spring prep, throwing down something like this with a high middle number and lower nitrogen is going to help promote more flowering, and hopefully you'll have brighter flowers, more consistent flowering, and a longer flowering period. Where if you put something with high nitrogen, that nitrogen is going to promote a lot of leaf growth and a lot of stem growth, and so you tend to get more really green plants, but then the flowers tend to not be maybe as prolific. So doing a high middle number can also help when fertilizing your perennials and things like that.
What is that number?
This is a 15. This is an 11, 15, 11. I have other ones that are like, let me grab one really quick. This blooming and rooting is a 9, 58, 8. So it's a 9, it's a 58, 59 of the middle number of your phosphorus. And so like, this is like drugs for plants. It really gives them like that little really big zing. So if your plants are getting to the point where they're ready to flower, but they're just not doing what you want, sometimes going and getting something like this. Now this is a water soluble versus a granular, so I like to do this more in the spring because this is gonna maybe fertilize it more throughout the season. But then you can go in with something like this and give them a little bit of the zing to really kind of force them into flowering if they're not flowering well. You could also do this on tomatoes. Sometimes people have problems, they get a lot of green growth on their tomato, but they're not getting any flowers or any fruit on their tomatoes.
And that would be good for like your flowering pots.
Yep, flowering pots is really good.
During the
Yep, especially on annuals, this is really good. So that's just an FYI, not necessarily for spring cleaning or spring to-do list, but something to keep in mind.
So you can use the root stimulator and the gardener special together. I mean, not exactly together, but apply one and then a week later apply the other. Or something
So
like that.
with this one, I usually recommend doing 3 treatments at least in the spring with it, every 10 to 14 days apart. So every 2 weeks apart, essentially. So if you, let's say things are starting to wake up right now. Right now is a great time to do fertilizing.
Right.
So you could, and depending, like normally a gallon is sufficient per plant, unless it's a really big tree or shrub that you're trying to help. Because you can also do this on struggling trees. Again, not just newly grown trees, but struggling trees. But if it's a new grown tree, it's a smaller tree or shrub that you're trying to help, that you planted last year, do it this spring, do it, and then wait 2 weeks, do it again, wait 2 weeks, do it again. So I do at least 3 treatments in the spring with this one. Because it's a liquid one, it's more of a fast release fertilizer. So compared to something like this, it's not gonna last as long in the soil. So you can do more treatments. But that's the thing with fertilizers, it's always read the label, because every fertilizer has a little bit different mix of what kind of nitrogen or what kind of phosphorus it has in it. And some of them are more fast release, so you have to do it more often because it dissipates faster. Some of them are maybe more of a slow release fertilizer, and so it has to bind to the soil first to kind of get the nutrients out of it. So it's always good to read the label and do according to the label, is my little caveat there when determining what to fertilize. But those are really good. The other thing that I wanted to mention that is a common thing in Utah is iron. Because of the kind of soil we have in Utah, we often are deficient in our iron, okay? Or you have iron in your soil, but your alkalinity, your pH of your soil is so high that the tree can't get that iron out of the ground, okay? So if you ever have yellowing leaves, it could maybe indicate an iron deficiency. And spring is a really good time to apply that iron, because it is, how I was always taught is, you imagine the tree has a straw into the ground sucking up iron, okay? And as long as there's a reservoir of iron in the ground that it can suck up, your tree is green. But at any time that reservoir gets depleted, or your pH gets so high that it can't suck it out. It's not able to suck it up. It will still keep on trying to suck it up, that iron out of the ground. But because it can't, it just sucks up air. Okay? And when it starts sucking up air, the leaves start to turn yellow because it's deficient in iron. Now you're like, oh, I have an iron problem. I go throw iron on the tree. You rejuvenate that reservoir of iron, and it starts sucking it up, but it still has that air pocket in that straw. And so it's still going to go yellow as it works through that air pocket. Okay? And then once it works through that air pocket and it gets that iron, it'll go green again. Okay? Now, so the idea is we're trying to prevent that air pocket from ever happening. Okay? And so you're just trying to keep that reservoir full. So if you know you've had problems in the past, spring, before it starts really putting on leaves and before it really starts taking up a lot of that iron out of the ground, getting that reservoir filled up to try to help it get through the whole season is kind of the idea here. So putting iron on in the spring, it can be helpful. Now there's lots of different kind of iron. These are both chelated irons, or irons that are bound to a molecule that makes it easier for the plant to take it up. Because if you just took iron shavings, put it in the ground, those shavings would have to rust and decompose and bind to the soil before they were usable, which could take years for raw iron. So these are iron that have already been pre-bound, making it easier. Now, but because of how high our alkalinity in, even some of these chelated irons like this one, sometimes if you have a high pH, are still not, the pH still makes it hard for it to take it up, even though it's bound, it's a chelated iron that is supposed to make it easier for the plant to take up. That's when this chelated iron, this EDDHA, comes in handy, because EDDHA, it's bound to a organic molecule, which makes it kind of bypasses the pH issue. So if you have high pH soil, again, if you do a soil test, that makes it more alkaline, less acidic, more alkaline as a high pH soil, then this one is a really good one to do because the tree can still take it up even if you have a high pH soil. Okay.
For your plants that you know need the more alkaline, more acidic, like your
Azaleas.
Well, I'm not going to plant azalea because I know they're going to be
Hydrangeas, maybe.
Well, hydrangeas are, but maybe a maple.
Yeah.
Maybe, is it better to go ahead and fertilize them with something?
So yes, as far as your spring, if you know you had an iron problem in the past, acidifying the soil around that root zone may be a solution to kind of help that soil. Okay, bring that pH down so the tree can naturally get the iron that it needs to get. Okay, now the problem by doing that, or not the problem, but things to consider. There's two kinds of sulfur, and that's, you usually use sulfur to acidify soil. One kind of sulfur is called a free sulfur, and that is just straight sulfur. It's free. There's another kind of sulfur that's called a combined sulfur. That's similar to this chelated iron. This is iron, but it's been combined to another molecule, making it chelated. So, a combined sulfur is going to acidify the soil very quickly and bring that pH down. But because it's already bound up to something, it tends to get washed out easy. It washes out a lot faster, okay? And so it'll acidify quickly, but it doesn't last as long because it washes out faster. Where a free sulfur, when you put a free sulfur on, it's going to take longer to acidify the soil, but it's going to last longer because what it has to do, that free sulfur has to bind to the soil molecules that you have in your soil, or the organic molecules you have in your soil, before it brings that pH down. So we do have free sulfur here, and in the spring, free sulfur is a really also good thing to do in the spring because it will help with the, it takes about 6 to 8-ish weeks for it to be effective. So if you put it on in the spring, by 6 to 8 weeks, when end of spring, summer comes, that soil is going to be more acidic, and then it'll last longer. And then during the summer or fall, if you have like a pH tester and you need to bring that pH down, then that's when the combined sulfur comes in handy because it quickly acidifies. So I like to do the free sulfur in the spring, and then the combined sulfur in the summer spring or summer fall when I need it quickly if it starts to go back up. But it washes out faster.
Okay.
So those, and doing a combination of an iron treatment as well as acidifying the soil can help if you know you had problems in the past with iron deficiency, which is a pretty common problem in Utah. So that is something that's kind of in that category of when you're doing your evaluation of your landscape. This tree had an iron deficiency, or the leaves are always yellow. Maybe it's an iron deficiency. Maybe I need to put that on my list of spring things to do, of when I fertilize it, also get it with some good fertilizer, or get it with some good iron.
How often would you add the iron to that?
In general, you can never go wrong with too much iron. Okay, like anything too much can be a poison, but when it's in the soil, in general, you're not going to ever get to that point where it's going to affect the tree. So in general, you're not going to, if you have a really major problem, that you have a problem year after year after year, I would probably be a little heavier. And I would probably do maybe a few treatments in the spring. So every 2 weeks apart. Do one now, do one in 2 or 3 weeks, do it again, wait another 2 or 3 weeks, do it again, and then hopefully that's enough. If it's just a little problem, but it's not a major problem, maybe just doing one treatment is enough. So again, a little trial and error, unless you get a soil test done, where you can kind of see like, oh, my iron is here, I need to bring it up to here, then maybe you could be more targeted on knowing exactly how much iron to do, but that's kind of...
Most of Utah soil has a pH in the high 7s, if not 8. One of the most acidic plants that you're going to find needs a pH of 4 points, which is like a blueberry needs a pH of about a 4
I find that
to a 5.
chelated iron like really quick results. Like 2 weeks later, the leaves are
And most plants.
Yeah, they can't, like, especially these chelated irons can be very quick, but it's like, iron, so one thing to know about iron is a non-relocatable nutrient in the tree, okay? And so if you wait too long and more leaves are starting to get yellow, yes, it'll green up the edge leaves, the new growth coming on, but it won't green up the old growth because it's non-relocatable. So that analogy, yes, you can sometimes see really fast results, but it still kind of applies where you're trying to, like, you put a little bit on, but then it depletes it again, so it can go yellow quickly. Yes. So
stay on top of it.
yeah, stay on top of it is the general rule. Keep that reservoir always full for best results. To kind of move on really quickly, I wanted to talk about, I'm going to jump prevent pests and disease, because a lot of what we are talking about will hopefully prevent some of those to begin with. But I want to kind of jump down to when can you start planting. In general, anytime. You can start planting now. The caveat, okay, the caveat here is if you are buying a new plant from us and it just came from California, or it just came from Oregon or Washington, usually they're about the same temperature of us, but they're usually a week or two ahead of us. Sometimes we'll get plants that are fully leafed out, okay? And then we have a week like we had today, where it got down to 30 degrees last night, and you have this new plant from Washington or Oregon or California, you have to be a little careful. So, but if you get a plant here that is dormant, that is tight budded, you're gonna be totally fine to plant in general. Okay, so once the ground can be dug, you can start planting. Once the ground can be dug, you can plant. The tender perennials and new arrivals like boxwoods, laurels may need frost protection. Kind of the idea there. Many grass perennials and frost tender annuals and vegetables arrive later. But we do have some here because some people are just really chomping at the bit. But those who are chomping at the bit to get things going, just be aware that you may need to put a frost cover over your plants in the spring if you're trying to get going on that. And then water new plants. If you don't have your irrigation system on yet, you still need to water your newly planted plants. Okay? The soil there, because it hadn't had anything during the winter, there was nothing there to keep the moisture in, and it's probably drier there than other places. So make sure you do it. And then if you have another thing in the spring is a good time to do for most plants right now is dividing perennials. So if you have old grown grasses that are starting to die in the middle, dividing it might be a good time to go in, cut it into 4 or so pieces, and replant them so that they kind of restart so you don't have that dead center. Or if you have things like daylilies are a common one. If you have daylilies that are been in the ground for a long time and they're really compact, sometimes the center won't maybe flower as consistently or as big. Dividing may be needed because they need more room. So going in, dividing it, spreading it out, making sure there's some room there. That's also hostas sometimes need to be divided. Often if you have old hosta patches, those need to be divided. Salvias are more kind of like grasses. Like if they get really big, you could probably go in and kind of cut them in half and plant 2 of them. But salvias can sometimes be under that category. Irises need it. Any bulb plant really need it to occasionally. So now when it's cooler, before the plant really starts to go crazy, when it's just starting to push through the ground is usually a good time to kind of divide those kind of plants. So spring is a good time. If you're like, I don't have the time to do it in the spring, you can also do it in the fall as well. But spring is a good time, and that might be part of your spring to-do list, is dividing perennials if you have some old patches. The last thing we kind of blew over was pruning. And on the back, there's a whole list here about pruning. The general rule for the timing of spring pruning is the timing for spring pruning is when the plant is dormant. Okay? So normally for like a lot of plants we say before the forsythia starts to bloom. Okay? Because once the forsythia blooms, things are starting to wake up. Okay? So the forsythia is blooming right now. So we are kind of maybe a little late on getting to the pruning, but a lot of plants are still pretty tight. So like I just pulled these, this is a hornbeam out there that I just pulled, and those buds are still pretty tight, it's still pretty dormant. This is an apple tree that's over here that is still pretty, the buds are still pretty tight and dormant. So I think you're totally fine to still prune a lot of these plants. But my rose is starting to already leaf out like crazy right now. Now, if it's really out of control, my guess is you're still fine to prune. It's not going to harm. But that's the ideal time to prune is when the plant is dormant. Okay? So in general, right now is still a good time though. Okay?
What about grapes?
Grapes, again, I usually do it when it's dormant before it gets really active.
It started to leak, the juices had
Yeah.
started to leak, but
Nobody? Yeah, a lot of plants will leak this time of year because they're starting to pull moisture more and starting to wake up. And so it's not uncommon for things like grapes to leak. But yeah, you're probably still fine to prune it right now. You shouldn't have an issue. And then I kind of have a little, I don't know necessarily want to go over this specifically, but the only one is I will put note on spring flowers versus summer flowers. So make sure you read that and realize that issue there. So things like a lot of hydrangeas are more summer flowers. And so if you prune them you can prune them now and be fine. But plants like lilacs are spring flowers. And if you prune them right now before they flower, you're not going to get any flowers. So you just have to kind of realize what kind of plants you have in your yard and whether it blooms in the spring or what kind of wood it springs. Pretty much, does it bloom on last year's flowers or wood, or does it bloom on this year's growth? And so you can kind of look that up, but that's just something to be aware of.
Like the tricks with clematis, because some clematis you prune early.
Whether it's type 1.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. The last thing I wanted to kind of, just because I'm running out of time, I did want to talk about preventative pests and diseases. Like last year, we had a kind of a wet spring, and so we had a really bad aphid problem last year. And also we kind of had a bad, last year because of the wet spring, we also had a bad, what's the word, powdery mildew issue and things like that. So disease prevention, if you know you've had a problem in the past, doing a spring disease prevention disease and insect prevention might be helpful. Two things to be maybe aware of. Horticulture oil is a really good product, and you can do that when the plant is dormant. Even up to this stage is still fine to spray. Even though the leaves are starting to come up, it's still really tight, you're still fine to spray. And in fact, spraying right now might be the ideal time for oils like this, because this is also when the buds start to wake up, that's when the little insects start to get more active. And so the idea is you're trying to smother any aphid eggs, or on apple trees would be like codling moth, or bugs that might be starting to wake up this time of year. You could spray them to try to mitigate against insects that are hibernating on your tree, causing problems. Also a good time is this liquid cop. Liquid cop is a disease control. So if you know you had problems on your plant in the past, potentially liquid cop could be an option to spray to help control, to be proactive in controlling spores of diseases such as fungal diseases or bacteria that may be wintering over on your plant, waiting for the right spring weather condition to start getting active again. So this could potentially be a solution as a preventative.
Does that help with like early signs of curly top?
I want to say yes. I maybe have to look up on that one. I forget exactly. There's so many diseases, so I like in
The big
general.
one for tomatoes out here, right?
Yeah, I don't know if this. I would be a little cautious on tomatoes on this one, because I think curly top is usually more of an insect problem. Because I think curly top is a viral disease, and this isn't going to help against viral, if I remember correctly.
It is.
Is it viral?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this isn't going to help against viral. And usually curly top is spread by leaf hoppers. So it's more of keeping them, like if you live by a field, you'll just have to maybe spray more often or try to protect them with some kind of cover that keeps the insects out, because they usually get spread by the leaf hopper, the Utah leaf hopper. But those are potential options here. And then fire blight is a big problem right now. Like not right now. It's when things are in flower. So when your apples and pear trees are in flower, they're receptible to fire blight, and that's why we spray in the spring. Might be a good time to spray with something like that. And then the last thing I wanted to just put a tidbit out there is I always get people in the fall who come in and are like, what's wrong with my lawn? And it's usually either summer patch or necrotic ring spot. Not usually, but often it's one of those ones. And that disease actually gets established in the lawn this time of year, okay? But you don't necessarily see the damage until summer, fall. Because, and so they think it's something happened during the summer, but it actually happened now. So if you think you may have like a fungal disease in your yard that you've been fighting, you can't get it under control, it might be one of those two diseases, and the time to treat for it is in the spring with a fungicide that we have here. But you want to do it when the soil temperature is 65 degrees. And that's when that disease colonizes in your soil. And if you try to treat it after that point, then it doesn't do any good.
Does that include fairy ring?
No, fairy ring's a little different. Fairy ring's a little different. So those are some, I just want to put, there are some specific diseases. I don't have the time to go into all the individuals,
Yeah.
but those are maybe some things just to be aware of. Is spring might be a good time if you know you've had a problem in the past to try to get a jump start on it.
If there's soil that I bought and it's been known to have like gnats in it, is there anything that you can spray on the topsoil before you plant to help fight them?
I have Benethrin you could try, which is this product right here. It's just an insecticide.
Yeah.
It resides in the soil a long time, so it hopefully would kind of kill the gnats as they hatch and stuff, and hopefully bring that population down. So there's things like that you can try, but not necessarily preventative. That would be more like you want to apply it when the temperatures are right for the insect to be active, so that you kill most of the insects, hopefully keeping the population down from getting out of control. So, but yeah, those are, I'm gonna open it up. I just have like 5-ish minutes here. Is there any last minute questions for the whole group? And then you can always come and chat with me in person or my team.
I'll chat with you in person.
Okay.
I have a maple tree.
Okay. Okay,
Thank you.
we're gonna wrap it up here. Like I said, I'm only one person, so I'll try to help where I can, but we also have Emily's here. She's really knowledgeable. James is here. He's very knowledgeable about plants. We also have Andrew, I think, is here somewhere, and Jerry. So we have a lot of people here that have a lot of knowledge here if you have any specific concerns or questions.
We love gardening.